The new programs are not out, but I Xeroxed one of the pages so you can see what we're going to do. We're going to continue, of course, with the United States. We're not going to give up on this country. We are going to continue. We're going to inhabit it with intelligence and conscience. And as they used to say, looking at the old car refurbished, people will whistle when we go by with it all refurbished. I want to start with an entry in Thoreau's journals from September 9th, 1851, 2 a.m. in the morning. Because this is the man. This is the inheritor of the Franklin Jefferson country. You know, Thoreau almost never mentions them. He never talks about Franklin and Jefferson. None of the transcendentalists did. Emerson. It's almost as if they didn't exist. It's almost as if this was completely accepted. Well, of course we have a country. Of course we have these nice little townships. Of course we have this intellectual freedom. By the 1830s, it's assumed by the American people that it's God's gift to them, and no one ever had to fight for it, much less really struggle to conceive the conditions under which it could manifest. So Franklin and Jefferson end up being like Himalayan peaks, lost in the mist, lost in the background. But because of the hermetic nature of their activity, there was a resonance, there was a vibration in the air, as it were. There was a cultural milieu that was extant, available, like Tesla's electrical energy. It was in the air, it was available to be drawn upon. And so we have Thoreau, who becomes a very peculiar human being. There's nobody like Thoreau before him in Western civilization. There just isn't anyone at all. To find someone like Thoreau, you have to go back either to the American Indians, or you have to go back to the old Chinese Taoists. Or further back, and this is what Thoreau began to recognize, you have to go back to ancient India, back to Upanishadic times, where the wise in life left man's realm and went back to nature. They went back to nature not to go back to nature qua nature, not to go back to the trees and the mountains and the streams, but to take themselves back there and open it up. It's like setting a butterfly free. And nature is transformed with that kind of an action. When man frees his spirit to nature, nature transforms and becomes a cosmos. And it is different. It is different. Here is a man. By 1851, Thoreau was quite far along, had realized that his relationship, for instance, with Emerson, the closest relationship of his life, was already beginning to fray. By 1850, Emerson had completed all of his major writings. Yes, English Traits would be published just 4 years later and would make a tremendous impact. But Emerson, the man, had somehow crested, had somehow matured, had come in the late 1840s, early 1850s to the fullness of himself and had begun to withdraw in some primordial sense. And Thoreau, sensitive to this, resents the fact that a great man is shriveling, resents the fact that homiletic confidence is beginning to displace the lightning and thunder of a free spirit roaming at will in the wildness of the world. He sensed that somehow Emerson had tamed those inner energies, but had tamed them in terms of the family in terms of fame, in terms of the publishing realm, in terms of his readers who trusted him, in terms of his family background, Thoreau becomes almost like a Gnostic who is suspicious of the demiurgic world and says, we cannot come to the terms that you have come to. We cannot agree to live in nature in terms of the provincial humanness which we have accepted. Because all of this is illusion. All of this is going to pass. And we need to address ourselves fresh. What are we in our spirit self? Get out of line from the stores. Get out of line from the railroad stations. Get out of line from even the Lyceum programs. Get out of even the small Athens of America, Concord, Massachusetts. Get out into the countryside. And so Thoreau is looking at this time, trying to find, almost like some Zen master, a way to make the world transparent to himself. Here's what he records. 2 a.m. in the morning, September 9th, 1851. Melville is working on Moby Dick in the same state, not very far away. The moon not quite full, going to Conatum via road. There is a low vapor in the meadows beyond the depot, dense and white, though scarcely higher than a man's head, concealing the stems of the trees. I see that the oaks, which are so dark and distinctly outlined, are illumined by the moon on the opposite side. Notice the contrasting in Thoreau's writing. Always a X of the unknown coming in to contrast, and what is generally known in a familiar way becomes transposed. It is now known in an unfamiliar way. This as I go up the back road. A few thin, ineffectual clouds in the sky. I come out thus into the moonlit night where men are not, as if into a scenery anciently deserted by men. The life of men is like a dream. It is 3,000 years since night has had possession. Go forth and hear the crickets chirp at midnight. Hear if their dynasty is not an ancient one and well-founded. I feel the antiquity of the night. She surely repossesses herself of her realms, as if her dynasty were uninterrupted, or she had underlain the day. No sounds but the steady creaking of crickets and the occasional crowing of cocks. I go by the farmers' houses and barns, standing there in the dim light under the trees, as if they lay at an immense distance or under a veil. The farmer and his oxen are all asleep now, not even a watchdog awake. The human slumbers. There is less of man in this world. The fog in the lowlands on the corner road is never still. It now advances and envelops me as I stand to write these words, then clears away and ever noiselessly step. It covers the meadows like a web. I hear the clock strike 3. Now at the clayey bank, the light of Orion's belt seems to show traces of the blue day through which it comes to us. The sky, at least, is lighter on that side than in the west, even about the moon. Even by night, the sky is blue and not black, for we see through the veil of night into the distant atmospheres of day. Thoreau becomes very much a resonance of some ancient tradition that was eclipsed in Roman times. a tradition that Pindar would have felt at home in, a tradition where Orpheus still sang with his 9-stringed lyre. It was the condition of the natural underlay of man before the death of Pan. You know, it was Plutarch who recorded the death of Pan about 130 AD. He recorded in the Moralia the discovery that Pan was dead, and the message shouted out to one of the capes of Brundisium, and there was a great mysterious moan from the forest. A trustworthy, stoic, staid old sea captain reported it at the Roman port. It said that some old mystical Greek oracle had told him to declare that Pan was dead to the woodland hills. And that was the response, a low moan. Thoreau brings it back. It is all back. She has been there all this while. But she has never been there since for European man. He's been blinded by the glare of his own egotistical thrust. And only when the veils were beginning to lift a little bit were there penetrations through. A little bit of Rousseau rowing himself on his lake in Switzerland. A little bit of Novalis looking into the mysteriousness of man. Occasionally we get the glimpse in Jefferson of the flaming intuition of the passing of an age, the ushering in of some new era. Thoreau brings this to be, and he writes that it must manifest with the individual. This is the important point. It cannot be there for some chimera. It has to be there for the person. There may be many persons, but it is the man. Remember how he wrote after he lived on Staten Island for a few months, trying to acclimate himself to the New York City environment. He said, when will man learn that 1,000,000 men will never replace one man, one human being? This was what was important to him. In his work, Thoreau had taken himself in 1845 by the suggestion of a very dear friend of his, Ellery Channing, the son, William Ellery Channing. He had been written that he would never amount to very much in the world until he took himself out of the condition, out of the society where he had labored in limbo, and took himself out somewhere to devour himself. This is the way Ellery Channing put it in a letter. My dear Thoreau, the handwriting of your letter is so miserable that I'm not sure I have made it out. If I have it, it seems that you are the same old sixpence you used to be, rather rusty, but a genuine piece. I see nothing for you in this earth, but that field which I once christened Briars. Go out upon that, build yourself a hut, and there begin the grand process of devouring yourself alive. I see no alternative, no other hope for you. Eat yourself up. You will eat no one else, nor anything else. Concord is just as good a place as any other. There are indeed more people in the streets of that village than in the streets of New York. This is a singularly muddy town, muddy, solitary, and silent. And so the Briars, which was a plot of many acres, 40, 50 acres, alongside the shores of Walden Pond, about 2 miles south of the then Concord city limits. It was a plot of ground that Emerson had bought, Ralph Waldo Emerson. They had spotted the harvesting of trees They were cutting down all the trees alongside Walden Pond. And so to preserve some of the watershed and the terrain, Emerson bought some acreages and later on would buy more to try to protect the pond. And they called it the Briars because it was left wild. So in 1845, in the spring, Emerson, caring for the younger Thoreau, always puzzled by Thoreau. He was an ambivalent package of dynamite. Emerson expected that he would become the man of Concord. He expected that, in fact, Thoreau would probably be the genius of his whole lot, and yet of all the people in Concord, he was the one that did the least. So he said, take the opportunity, go out to the land. And so Thoreau went out, and he built himself a 10-foot by 15-foot hut. He built it himself. He felled the trees. The pines there are very much like arrows. It's very easy to strip them of their branches. And he made 6-inch square beams, leaving on the top side the roundness of the bark of the tree. It makes a beam stronger. And for the walls, he finished only 2 sides of it so that the rough sides would take the chinking better. And he set this up, built the frames, as was the tradition then, and when it came time to raise the frames, well, he had a raising party out there. And Emerson and Alcott, Hawthorne, living in Concord at that time, Thoreau, the whole crowd of them went out there and one afternoon raised these frames and laid on the ceiling. And it wasn't until November that Thoreau got around to putting the chinking in. He loved to rough it. He had a table, which he made. He had a cot, which he made. He had 3 chairs. And I think he had some bookcases that he made out of driftwood. Thoreau was extremely talented with his hands, whether it was carpentry or machinery or anything. Thoreau was a genius. He seems to be the arch foe of industrialism, and yet he is a mechanical genius of the first order. He is the man who figured out the matrix for making a superior graphite, which they used in the family pencil works. And they found out that his graphite was so fine, it was a refined product, that it was used when electrotyping first came in. And the Thoreau family began to make $6,000 to $10,000 per year in the 1840s from selling bulk graphite to printing outfits. And pretty soon it became known across the country, and the Thoreau family were encouraged to open up branch offices all over the country, the Midwest, New York, even in Germany. Thoreau had figured out the process, had figured out how to do this and make it happen. He was that kind of a talented genius. And he applied himself in making the Walden cabin. And when he got it fashioned, it seemed to constellate for the first time the image of the man in the eyes of everyone else. He had been a ne'er-do-well, and all of a sudden, in the space of a couple of months, because he had built his hut out in the sticks, Thoreau was the wise man. People started to go out there to visit him. They couldn't keep away from him. Hawthorne be brooding over some of his work. Unable to talk to anyone else, he would go out to Walden and sit there, sometimes in solitude. Thoreau was great at leaving you alone. Or sometimes in that kind of deadly accuracy, Thoreau would bring out, fragment by fragment, spark by spark, the real energy in the issue. Whole droves of school children would come out to learn about nature. It was found out that Thoreau could talk to animals. He would have a whole group of school children sitting in the Walden cabin, on the cots, on the chairs, on the floor, and he would leave the front door open. It's just a 10 by 15 room. And he would go outside the door, and he would start humming deep in his throat, in his chest, making strange vibratory sounds. And pretty soon the little woodchucks would come out. The crows would come and land on his shoulder. All the little woodland animals, just like in Snow White, all gather around him, and he would talk to them in these vibratory tones, clicking and humming and so forth, and then feed them. And the little children all inside realizing, here's the magician of the woods. And he would come in then and he would tell the children stories of the Indians, the human beings who used to live here, who used to all do this. Everyone knew how to talk to the animals. Everyone knew how to talk to the trees. The wilderness was a home for the whole people. And so he would take them out and they would look for Indian artifacts. You know, once an expert ethnologist visited Emerson's house and he was introduced to Thoreau, and within several hours Thoreau had reduced him to silence because the man didn't know anything about the Indians. He knew what you could find in books, but he didn't know the lifeblood. He didn't know that energized wave of reality which the American Indian expressed by his life. But Thoreau was affine to that all the time. And so Walden became a very curious situation. It was from some hours on certain days, solitude, to other hours in the next day. It was the site of great family picnics, everybody coming out and camping on the front forest lawn. It was about 200 feet up from the pond. And Thoreau would be the focus of the whole town. And he was finally identified. Somebody who had been nebulous before was suddenly seen to represent what Emerson said, we should put him on the payroll. The town needs a professional naturalist, someone who conducts us, Hermes-like, back to the natural order, who brings the message of the gods, Mother Nature. People had criticized Thoreau. They say, you talk about Mother Nature as she was your mother-in-law, as if she's someone. And he would say, she is. Of course she is. Of course we are related to her. She is conscious. We are, in every respect, her children. This would bother people until Walden was built, and the Walden cabin catapulted Thoreau in the mind of those who knew him at the time as someone who was successful. What he used Walden for himself, was a chance to bring together the disparate experiences of about 10 years and put them into books. He wrote a week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers there, and he wrote the first draft of Walden, all within a space of about a year and a half, year and 3/4. It was a shaping process. The making of the cabin hut was the making of the man, and from the making of the man, coming into manifestation as a being, identifiable, he was able to project that out and create books which were in the shape of the man. It's almost like a Platonian emanation. Until the man was there, the books couldn't be there, because the books were a new literary genre. They were not works of literature from the mind. They were projections of a pattern of wholeness from the man. And so Thoreau's works are neither fiction nor nonfiction. And they're not an amalgam of fiction and nonfiction. They are presentations rather than representations. Nothing is fictionalized. And because nothing is fictionalized, there is no contrasting nonfiction. All that is possible is presented. It is a literature of the possible, presented completely, and there the man rings clear in terms of his motion, in terms of his mobility within nature. Well, you can step back and say, isn't that a nature spirit? Yes, if you pronounce both words equally. Then that's what man was for Thoreau. And for a year and a half, or a year and 3/4, Walden was the site of many a fine conversation. And because he seemed to be identified, the tax people brought him in. They said, "We want to tax you. What do you own?" And he said, "I don't own anything." "Don't you own this cabin?" "No, I don't own this cabin. I built it with the help of friends, but I don't own it." "Don't you own the land?" "No, I don't own the land." "What about your family business?" "I don't own that." "Well, what do you own?" He said, "I think I own a rowboat I made." So they looked it up in the books and they said, "Well, we can't really get you. It isn't really a viable vehicle for the tax rolls. Get out." And they couldn't tax him. Well, this bothered Thoreau. He began to think about the fact that they were taxing him. What were they doing with his money anyway? And he realized that it was the government that was taking the money. Well, what was the government doing with it? Well, they were building structures. What kind of structures? Political structures. Well, that got under Thoreau's skin, because it was those political structures that he resented. The firmer they became, the more trees were cut down. The more people were anesthetized by falsity in traditions. And then Thoreau remembered that there was an issue that was bright in his family, and that was slavery. The Thoreau family, all of them, were early members of the Abolitionist Society. Something founded, incidentally, by Benjamin Franklin near the end of his life, and continued by Jefferson. But by the 1830s, it had become a real issue, almost like a party. William Lloyd Garrison was the great spokesman for it, and Nathaniel Rogers, also a great spokesman for it. But Thoreau's family were organizers. They were active, militant, anti-slavery people. That is to say, they harbored slaves fleeing in their homes, fed them, gave them money, helped them to get to Canada. It was the Underground Railroad, and Thoreau's hut at Walden became one of those centers, and it hit him when he began thinking about the taxation, that they were using this money eventually to squelch and suppress his fellow man. And so he went to the sheriff of the town. He said, "I'm not going to pay any taxes." And the sheriff said, "Well, you haven't ever paid any taxes. That's nothing new." He said, "No, I want you to understand, I refuse to recognize your authority to tax me." And he made his point so vociferously that the man said, "Well, Henry, we're going to have to put you in the pokey." And so they stuck Thoreau in jail for a night. Some cloaked figure came and delivered the money to the sheriff as soon as word leaked out that he was in jail. The sheriff said, "I think I'll leave him there for the night." Now, the jail in Concord was a huge building. It was the jail for the whole countryside. It was 3 stories high, some 65 feet long. It had about 18 cells that were almost as large as half this room here, 26 feet by 8.5 feet. Usually 2 people in a cell. And as soon as Thoreau got in that jail environment, he began to do his militant work. He started interviewing all the prisoners. What are you in here for? What are conditions like? And he found out that his cellmate had been there for 3 months. He'd fallen asleep in a barn, and his pipe had ignited the barn and it burnt down, and they weren't sure what to do with him. Anyway, he had been there for 3 months, and so Thoreau got a history of the whole jail from him. And he started formulating in his mind the idea that the government cannot incarcerate individuals on the basis of illusionary laws. And the more he thought about this, the more he thought that it is the right of the individual as a spiritual being to deny them the reality, to deny them the confirmation of the reality of their illusion. And so he began to write, and he worked up a nice little article on this. It was entitled variously, but generally is known as the Essay on Civil Disobedience. And it first appeared, incidentally, in a magazine, or rather part of it appeared in a magazine. Because of the dynamite nature of some of his observations, they didn't quite print all of it. He had problem with several of his essays. And most of these problem essays were collected together about 4 years after Thoreau's death. And this is the first edition of it. It's called A Yankee in Canada and Other Essays. Anti-Slavery and Reform Papers. That's what it's called. And it was published in 1866. It was finally able to be published after the Civil War was over. But Thoreau had written it in 1846. Now, this was a very touchy time. The United States had declared war on Mexico. Oh, yes, we went into Mexico. What's the Marine song from the halls of Montezuma? They were there. So this militancy of the United States was feeding everybody. Texas had just come into the Union, a la Sam Houston's bravery, and Americans were getting a little huffy about the British designs on the Oregon Territory, and they were getting a little feisty about everything. They didn't want to hear about somebody who wasn't going to pay his taxes, especially on a philosophic basis. Oh, he says in here, he writes, I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. He doesn't give the attribution. I think Jefferson carved that over his bathroom mirror. Thoreau writes, and I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which I also believe. That government is best which governs not at all. Well, that's just for openers. And the essay on civil disobedience, which wasn't heard in the 19th century. It was so radical that it was not heard. The first people that began to hear this, people like H. Salt in England, who then influenced people like Mahatma Gandhi. But it wasn't really digested even by Gandhi. The first person to really understand what Thoreau was writing was Martin Luther King, Jr. And he used to pass around, the Southern Christian leadership used to pass around little Xeroxes of portions of the essay on civil disobedience, especially for those who were learning to take the clubs, which is very hard to do. It's hard to stand there and take punishment. And you have to understand that there's a moral issue at stake, and that one's non-response is spiritualizing the process, making sacred the process. And Thoreau's writing here becomes exceedingly powerful when understood in that regard. Also collected with the essay on civil disobedience, incidentally here, was his wonderful little essay, Paradise to be Regained. To be regained. He writes, fellow men, I promise to show the means of creating a paradise within 10 years, where everything desirable for human life may be had by every man in superabundance, without labor and without pay. Now this begins to sound very much like the French utopianists, Charles Fourier and so forth, Saint-Simon, Proudhon. This is the kind of language that cracked Europe open in 1848. It's interesting that Thoreau writes these essays in the United States at about the time that these ideas are also being acted out in Europe, especially in France. And the revolutionary year of 1848 ties in very, very closely and very neatly with a lot of Thoreau's writings. In fact, one has to read very carefully, and you run across the name of most of the French utopian writers. Fourier said that there need to be human communities consciously selected aside, that there were so many types of human beings, and you need two people of each type. I think the issue finally came down to Southeast Pantisocracy, Coleridge's writings. The idea that we need to have experimental communities of a complete, clear, pure cross-section of humanity to see what man looks like together, what mankind looks like. And that for this you need the integrity of individuals. All of this began to work at this time in the 1840s, and Thoreau is about the only individual in this country who seems to speak up to this. There are also essays like Herald of Freedom, and for Thoreau, the middle 1840s becomes a time of consolidation. The writing of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, the writing of Walden, the building of the cabin, the identifying of himself as a spiritual naturalist whose message is to reawaken those affinities with the cosmos which man has somehow lost. And it's curious to notice the surreal displacement here, because he's writing this only 20 years after Jefferson has died. But there's almost no conscious cognition that all this was planned for, that all of this was made possible because of 50 years of incredible revolution and turmoil, making possible these insights. In fact, in Thoreau's journal, we read, quite interesting, Walking by Night, again, 1851, again. This is from August the 12th, 1:30 a.m. And he writes, sitting on the sleepers of Hubbard's Ridge, which is being repaired now, 3 o'clock a.m., I hear a cock crow. How admirably adapted to the dawn is that sound, as if made by the first rays of light rending the darkness. The creaking of the sun's axle heard already over the eastern hills. Though man's life is trivial and hand-celled, nature is holy and heroic. With what infinite faith and promise and moderation begins each new day. It is only a little after 3 o'clock, and already there is evidence of morning in the sky. He rejoices when the moon comes forth from the squadrons of the clouds unscathed. And there are no more obstructions in her path, and the cricket also seems to express joy in his song. It does concern men who are asleep in their beds, but it is very important to the traveler. Whether the moon shines bright and unobstructed or is obscured by clouds, it is not easy to realize that serene joy of all the earth when the moon commences to shine unobstructedly, unless you have often been a traveler by night. The traveler represents, as it were, the wind, and rustles the leaves or rustles the water, increasing the coolness of the night at such an hour. A solitary horse in his pasture was scared by the sudden sight of me, an apparition to him, standing still in the moonlight and moving about, inspecting with alarm, but I spoke, and he heard the sound of my voice, and at once stood reassured and expressed his pleasure by wagging his stump of a tail, though still half a dozen rods off. How wholesome the taste of huckleberries, when now by moonlight I feel for them amid the bushes. And now the first signs of morning attract the traveler's attention, and he cannot help rejoicing, and the moon begins gradually to fade from his recollection. The wind rises and rustles the trees. The sand is cool on the surface, but warm 2 or 3 inches beneath, and the rocks are quite warm to the hand, so that he sits on them or leans against them for warmth, though indeed it is not cold elsewhere. As I walk along the Fairhaven Hill, I see a ripple on the river, and now the moon is gone behind a huge black mass of clouds. I realize I may not see her again in her glory this night, that perchance ere she rises from this obscurity, the sun will have risen, and she will appear but as a cloud herself, and sink unnoticed in the west. As yet no sounds of awakening men, only the more frequent crowing of cocks still standing on their perches in the barns. And so Thoreau glides phantasmally like some hermetic messenger of a new kind of day. Man is a natural spirit moving phantasmally in industrial civilization, beginning to record the observations of people who haven't even yet been born, a generation that will find in Thoreau a great-granddaddy, someone whom they can claim to be part of their family. I'm going to put into the record a page from Civil Disobedience. Of course, you can find it for yourselves and read the whole thing. If the tax gatherer or any other public officer asks me, as one has done, "But what shall I do?" my answer is, if you really wish to do anything, resign your office. When the subject has refused allegiance and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished. Both sides have to do it. We have to say that this relation will no longer obtain. And if we withdraw our consent on both sides of it, the relation ceases. Was it real in that case? It was unreal. Was it necessary? It was unnecessary. The mind that saw it as real and as necessary was deluded. This, of course, is basic Buddhism. Emerson used to call him a Spartan Buddhist. He went to London, and he was going to be gone for about a year, and so he made arrangements to have Thoreau take over his family. Trusted the man so implicitly. He had 3 children under 8 at that time, and Thoreau tended everything, kept up the garden, which produced food in those days, kept up the household, took care of the family. And when the youngest one, 3 years old, said, "Are you my new daddy?" Thoreau wrote to Emerson and said, "I think you better come home." When he came back from Walden with the manuscript of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, he went through the terrible process of trying to find a publisher, which was then, ever as it has been, it's hard to find an honest publisher. I've never published anything for 20 years because I can't find an honest publisher. But Thoreau finally settled with a company that would produce 1,000 copies of The Week, and they would be paid back through the proceeds of the sale. And so it came out 75 copies were sent out to reviewers of all kinds. And it received some notice, but it didn't sell. And so it took Thoreau 4 years to work off the debt. And finally, when he had paid it off, he received a wagon load of 706 copies of his book. He recorded in his journal, he said, "I have a library now of 900 volumes. Over 700 I've written myself." Years later, some man recalled as a young boy being sent as a messenger over to the Thoreau household, and they'd heard about this library of 1 volume. So when the door was open and there was Thoreau, as a young boy, this man said he kept looking around Thoreau to look up the stairs to see if he could get sight of this famous library of 1 book many, many times, a whole wall of just 1 book. I don't think it was until 1868 that the edition was finally sold out, long after Thoreau was gone. Incidentally, when it was finally printed in a corrected edition in 1868, it's been in print now for 120 years and has sold adequately every year since then. This is a classic literature. This is a literature for the ages. This is a kind of a person who's making a new scene, a different genre, something that hadn't been seen before. But we notice after Walden, Thoreau's emphasis begins to change. He becomes more and more exacting. He becomes more and more scientific, sometimes to his own chagrin. He says, "What am I doing? I am not happy until I know the Latin scientific name of a grass. And when I hear the scientific name, I suddenly feel akin to it." He is in the Hermetic tradition, where science and mysticism are the same process. This is what makes it Hermetic. What makes it Hermetic is that it comes from a standpoint of unity rather than a standpoint of multiplicity. It is not a mental structure. It is a spiritual flow. And it's Hermetic because it is sealed. It's not sealed against something or against anything else. It is sealed with the holy seal of unity. It has no moving parts. When it moves, all moves as one. Nature for Thoreau is a hermetic horizon wherein consciousness occurs rather selflessly because there is no differentiation, particularly to recommend structure. One of the lost journals from 1840-41 was found in our time, not too long ago, published in 1958 by Perry Miller. He gave it the title, Consciousness in Concord. Here's an entry, interesting for the tone. Saturday, October 3rd, 1840. No man has imagined what private discourse his members have with surrounding nature, or how much the tenor of that intercourse affects his own health and sickness. While the head goes stargazing, the legs are not necessarily astronomers too, but are acquiring an independent experience in lower strata of nature. How much do they feel when they do not which they do not impart? How much rumor dies between the knees and the ears? Surely instinct uses this experience of the dumb members. I am no more a free man of my own members than of universal nature. After all, the body takes care of itself. It saves itself from a fall. It eats, drinks, sleeps, perspires, digests, grows, dies, and the best economy is to let it alone in all these. Why need I to travel to seek a sight and consult the points of the compass? My eyes are south windows, and out of them I command a southern prospect. That when man is unified, wherever he looks, that's the coordinate. However he is, that is the state of the universe. That the edge, the palpable threshold of consciousness is the physical world. And if man is unified, all nature sings to him as one song. And so he writes, "But pray, what has seeing to do with the soul? That she must always sit at a window? For I find myself always in the rear of my eye. However I look, my looking is me. However I compose as I see, that composition is myself." Consciousness in concord. Notice now the contrast 13 years later. The same journals, the journals of Thoreau run to 20 volumes. 20 volumes. Incidentally, this experiment of Thoreau will become picked up by Walt Whitman. And Whitman will work with it not in terms of landscape, but in terms of people. Leaves of Grass is a visionary unity in terms of people, humanity. Thoreau in terms of nature. And it won't be until our time that a great American poet will put it all together and take people and nature as an integral. And of course, because we live in such a degenerate age with no taste at all, that the poet is almost unknown. His name is Theodore Roethke. And in the library of the University of Washington, there are 12 feet of Roethke's notebooks of every instant for years and years and years on end, integrating. And he wrote his poems out of these notebooks, sometimes taking images from dozens of separate years and putting them together and drawing universal poems out of a substratum of a life flow which was chronicled indefinitely in detail in terms of both landscape and personage. Sometime in the 21st century, there'll be a poetry again, and Roethke will be high on the list. Roethke. It was his sister that taught me to write when I was 12 and 14 years old. Here is Thoreau now, 1853, 13 years later from the Consciousness and Concord Journal. "Evening draws on while I am gathering bundles of pennyroyal on the further Conatum height." It's a hillock. "I find it amid the stubble mixed with blue curls, and as fast as I get my hands full, tie it into a fragrant bundle. Evening draws on, smoothing the waters and lengthening the shadows, now half an hour or more before sundown. What constitutes the charm of this hour of the day? Is it the condensing dews of the air just beginning, or the grateful increase of shadows in the landscape?" This is August. "Some fiat has gone forth and stilled the ripples of the lake. Each sound and each sight has acquired ineffable beauty. How agreeable when the sun shines at this angle, to stand on one side and look down on flourishing sprout lands or forests, where the cool shade is mingled in greater proportion than before with the light. Broad, shallow lakes of shadow stretch over the lower portions of the top of the woods. 1,000 little cavities are filling with coolness. Hills and the least inequalities in the ground begin to cast an obvious shadow. The shadow of an elm stretches quite across the meadow. I see pigeons in numbers fly up from the stubble. I hear some young bluebird's plaintive warble near me, and some young hawks utter a pulsing scream from time to time across the pond, to whom life is yet so novel. Far over the pond and woods, I also hear a farmer calling loudly to his cows in the still air, 'Kir, kir, kir.' What shall we name this season? This very late afternoon or very early evening, this severe and placid season of the day most favorable for reflection. After the insufferable heats and bustles of the day are over, and before the dampness and twilight of evening, the serene hour, the muses' hour, the season of reflection. It is commonly desecrated by being made tea time. It begins perhaps with the very earliest condensation of moisture in the air, when the shadows of hills are first observed and the breeze begins to go down and birds begin again to sing. The pensive season. It is earlier than the chaste eve of the poet. Bats have not come forth. It is not twilight. There is no dew yet on the grass, and still less any early star in the heavens. It is the turning point between afternoon and evening. The few sounds now heard, far or near, are delicious. It is not more dusky and obscure, but clearer than before. The clearing of the air by condensation of mists more than balances the increase of shadows. Chaste eve is merely preparing to draw over all. It is a season somewhat earlier than that celebrated by poets. There is not such a sense of lateness in approaching night as they describe. The poet arouses himself and collects his thoughts. He postpones tea indefinitely. Thought now takes her siesta. Each sound is a broad and deep relief of silence. That's a mature consciousness. Thoreau's journal grew constantly as he was working on it. But he was attempting at this time to bring books into being, to give them a shape. He began to take journeys. He took a journey to Canada. He went by rail, went to Montreal, went to Quebec, finally would walk as far down the St. Lawrence as St. Anne's. He was appalled by the presence of armed and uniformed troops in the streets of the Canadian cities. How unlike America, how unlike the New England where the civilian held sway. The citizen was the population. There was a definite military presence. And they were so used to walking across land, and he would come across fences constantly. And when evening came in New England, you could knock at anyone's door and they would rent you a sleeping space for the night in the house or the barn. It was the open courtesy of a free land. And in Canada, when they knocked to find a place for the evening, they were told to go away. They're robbers. They're under suspicion. He said this is the underside of the military presence. The militarization produces this skittishness. And finally, he would lay the blame for it all at the door of the church. He says the church, with a false religion, has led man astray from himself. And when A Yankee in Canada was finally put into magazine serial form, the magazine editors began to delete all the toothed passages, and Thoreau withdrew it from publication. It was half published, and he said no more. And it was never published again in his lifetime. And people say, well, it's such a boring work. It really is minor. There's nothing boring that comes forth from an awakened consciousness. It is he who is the guiding star who points to our presence, not his alone, our presence. And this is what makes Thoreau valuable to us. He constellates the tremendous energy field that was engendered consciously by Franklin and Jefferson, and brings it home to some human heart, someone you could talk to. He would begin taking travels then in various spots, and again he would notice the contrast between the life vision that he was enjoying daily, momentarily, and the tremendous sense of confusion arising within society, within the cities, within his other population. He went with his friend, Ellery Channing, to see the ocean. He wanted to see the ocean and experience the ocean. So they went to Cape Cod. And he went back to Cape Cod some 10 or 11 months later by himself, because Emerson had gone there in between and brought back some berries he hadn't seen. And Thoreau was upset with himself because he had not paid attention, he had not done his work, he had not recorded the fine detail of reality properly. And so he sent himself back, go back to Cape Cod, go back and see it. And he went alone, and he came back to the lighthouse where he'd stayed, and the keeper said, "You know, the soldiers, men, the police were looking for you. There had been a robbery in Providence. And they thought that you had done it, you and your friend. Why else would people go to all the trouble to walk along the Cape Cod stretch of beach out of sight of other people? You were looking for a way to get off Cape Cod and get away with the stolen goods." Already, by the 1850s, the sense of corruption, of suspicion was coming in. Where is it coming from? It's coming, obviously, from some kind of militarization of life which is not yet visible in Concord, but must be there in the air. And of course, as soon as he looked at the papers, the Mexican War was proof enough. Of course. Oh, yes. Thoreau was so sensitive to events that when the John Brown events occurred, he became physically ill, almost into a coma. He could not stand the fact that man on this verge, on this threshold of being real for the first time in 3,000 years to himself, was going to corrupt it all over again with the delusions that always smear and always blur not only the real, but the sense of the individual who is the threshold of the real. This became a real problem for him, and so he began returning at least once more to various places that he would visit. And so he fell into a pattern of visiting a place, taking notes on the way, bringing them back, writing out his memories and his imaginations. Then several months or a year or so later, going back to the same place and reconnoitering and comparing what has he seen. He did this when he went to Maine. The Maine woods is a record of his desire to go and climb Mount Caton, the highest point in Maine, which at that time was beyond the edge of civilization. One had to go some 80 miles in from the coast, and then one went by canoe another 15 or 20 miles, and then one hiked from there. And for Thoreau, it was a tremendous realization that the only people that still lived there were the Indians. They were still alive, still there. And when he got, and you can read for it in the Maine woods, when he got to the top was not a point, but it was a plateau land. And it was all shrouded in clouds, and there was nothing but glistening, wet boulders and rocks in the clouds. And Thoreau walking in that, and these intuitions of man being caught in this nightmare all over again of the false, the demiurgic world of delusion. And he records how he was glad to come down off the mountaintop. There was something there, an insight, that he was not ready to make conscious for himself. It was before his time. He wasn't ready to face that scale of disappointment. For weeks afterwards, Thoreau, extremely depressed, One finds a kind of almost irritability in his journal against everyone. He had glimpsed something which was there in nature, which we call evil, which still circulates for man, and that it was not going to be easy. It is difficult because the path to the top of the mountain leads to this kind of morass where you need an inner coordination because the external coordinates do not work. The textbooks are no good. The systems of orientation don't work. And if one is not real and free from within, then you are lost. Thoreau, in writing The Maine Woods, in writing Cape Cod, writing Walden, writing A Week, the Concord and Merrimack, gave a shape to limited excursions, trips, travelers' books, naturalist books, which, when you read them as naturalist books, dissolve back into a portrait of some consciousness seeking to objectify itself. Rethke writes in one of his notebooks, to love the object is to love life. Life requires that it be manifest, requires that it be there. The urge to materialize, the urge to matter is a natural direction, a natural vectoring of life energies. It of itself comes into being. And the objectification is not an illusion or delusion, but is a natural occurrence. And for Thoreau, these works were excursions into the materializing. But the work that was not published, except in excerpts throughout his lifetime, were the journals. And that was where he was recording, in the largest possible scale, that flow that he was beginning to recognize as himself. He entered into a wonderful correspondence with a man named Harrison Otis Gray Blake, who saved a number of his letters, some 49 of his letters, and they were published later on in his life. And we see the philosophic Thoreau coming out in those. But here from the journals, 1851, Christmas Day, 1851. It would be a truer discipline for the writer to take the least film of thought that floats in the twilight sky of his mind for his theme, about which he has scarcely one idea. That would be teaching his ideas how to shoot. Faintest intimations, shadowiest subjects, make a lecture on this. By assiduity and attention, get perchance 2 views of the same. Increase a little the stock of knowledge, clear a new field instead of manuring the old. Instead of making a lecture out of obvious truths, hackneyed to the minds of all thinkers. We seek too soon to ally the perceptions of the mind to the experience of the hand, to prove our gossamer truths practical, to show their connection with our everyday life, better show their distance from our everyday life, to regulate them to the cider mill and the banking institution. Give me pure mind, pure thought. Let me not be in haste to detect the universal law. Let me see more clearly a particular instance of it. Much finer themes I aspire to, which will yield no satisfaction to the vulgar mind, not one sentence for them. Perchance it may convince such that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in their philosophy. Dissolve one nebula, and so destroy the nebular system and hypotheses. Do not seek expressions. Seek thoughts to be expressed. By perseverance, you get two views of the same rare truth. That way of viewing things you know of, least insisted on by you, however least remembered, take that view, adhere to that, insist on that, see all things from that point of view. Will you let these intimations go untended to and watch the bell or door or knocker? That is your text. Do not speak for other men, speak for yourself. They show you as in a vision the kingdoms of the world and all the worlds, but you prefer to look in upon a puppet show. Though you only speak to one kindred mind in all time, though you speak not to one, but only utter aloud that which you the more completely realize, and live in the idea which contains the reason of your life, that you may build yourself up to the height of your conceptions, that you may remember your Creator in the days of your youth, and justify his ways to man, that the end of life may not be its amusement. Speak, though your thought presupposes the non-existence of your hearers. Speak, thoughts that transcend life and death. What through mortal ears are not fitted to hear, absolute truth. Thoughts that blot out the earth are best conceived in the night, when darkness has already blotted it out from sight. We then look for inspiration. And so Thoreau, at the same time as Melville writing Moby Dick, says Americans have come to a specialty. They're going to be at home in the unknown. They're going to be free to be themselves without any identity. They had cut loose from the shores of recognition and had gone out on the oceans of presentation. Well, we'll see more because Thoreau lived another 12 years and developed an incredible capacity. And we'll see next week how he manages to waken in Walt Whitman's mind in New York a glimmer of a possibility.